When the nurse handed me my son, I froze. He was black. I'm white. My wife nearly fainted. The fluorescent lights in the maternity ward were too bright, almost surgical in their sharpness, and I remember thinking how clinical the moment felt for something that was supposed to be pure. I had waited 9 months for this, counting every kick and ultrasound, hearing my wife Elise talk about names, about futures, about how this baby would bind us even closer than we already were. But the second the nurse placed the tiny bundle in my arms, the world cracked. The child staring back at me wasn't mine. He was beautiful, healthy, crying with that raw new life sound that pierces straight through your chest. But he wasn't mine. His skin was clearly darker, his features unmistakable. I didn't need a chart, a lecture, or a family tree to see what was in front of me. I am white. Elise is white. Our son, the boy I had been waiting to meet, was black. The nurse smiled, oblivious, and said something about how strong his lungs were. My hands trembled, not from the weight of the child, but from the weight of reality crashing in all at once. Behind me, my mother gasped. My father looked away as if staring too long might drag him into the same disbelief I was drowning in. Elise, lying on the bed, caught my expression. She didn't beam with the pride of a new mother. Her lips parted, eyes widening in panic. For a second I thought she might be about to scream, but instead she whispered something I couldn't catch, and then her face drained of color. She nearly fainted, asking for water, asking for the room to spin less. I held the boy, stunned, feeling sweat slide down the back of my neck. People around us acted as if this was the most normal delivery in the world. But I knew better. My family knew better. Even Elise knew better. When the nurse left us alone, I gently set the baby down in the clear hospital bassinet. My arms felt like they belonged to someone else, heavy and foreign. Elise tried to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. She said maybe the lighting made things look strange. Maybe it was something in our bloodline we didn't know about. The excuses came out scrambled, weak, like she had rehearsed them for years, and they still collapsed under the weight of obvious truth. I didn't answer her. Not then. Instead, I stared at the child, this boy who had just been born into a storm he had no role in creating. The rest of that day unfolded like a nightmare you couldn't wake up from. Family members left in silence, not wanting to be the first to ask the questions hanging in the air. The doctors congratulated us and moved on. Elise pretended to be exhausted, turning away from me whenever I caught her eyes. But my mind wasn't quiet. It raced, piecing together fragments. Elise's late nights at work functions, her sudden insistence on privacy with her phone, the way she had been oddly defensive whenever I asked about her new coworker. I had brushed it off at the time, telling myself I was overthinking. Now, standing in that hospital room, every dismissed suspicion came roaring back, rearranging itself into something undeniable. That evening, when visiting hours ended and the ward quieted down, I found myself sitting in the uncomfortable plastic chair by the window, the city lights glowing beyond the glass. I could hear Elise breathing heavily in what was supposed to be sleep. But it wasn't restful. It was the restless kind, the kind where someone keeps their eyes closed just to avoid a conversation. I pulled out my phone. There are kits you can order, ones that test paternity as simply as swabbing a cheek. It felt surreal even typing the words DNA test into the search bar while my newborn son slept 10 feet away. But I knew I had to. I couldn't walk out of that hospital carrying nothing but doubt. I placed the order discreetly, knowing it would arrive at my office in a few days. My job gave me a neutral mailing address Elise wouldn't question. The plan began forming on its own. Swab the baby, send it in, wait for confirmation. If I was wrong, then the guilt of doubting Elise would be mine to carry. But if I was right, then the truth would be undeniable, concrete, a weapon I could wield when the time came. The days in the hospital dragged. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, smiling at the boy, oblivious to the tension sitting like smoke in that room. I went through the motions of being a father, changing diapers, holding him, burping him after feedings, but it felt like I was moving underwater, playing a part one hadn't auditioned for. Elise avoided conversations, offering small talk about formula brands or diaper sizes, as though we could leapfrog over the gaping hole between us. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to shake her awake, force her to admit what we both already knew. But I kept my mouth shut, not out of fear, but out of strategy. Confronting her without proof would be handing her the chance to spin more lies. I needed evidence. Evidence stronger than skin tone, stronger than suspicion. On the third day, we were cleared to go home. Elise held the baby in the car seat, staring out the window while I drove in silence. Every stoplight felt like an interrogation lamp. Every glance in the rearview mirror like another witness waiting for me to act. When we reached our house, Elise slipped upstairs with the baby almost immediately. I lingered downstairs, pacing the living room like a caged animal. The framed wedding photos on the walls mocked me. Her in her white dress, me with a grin so wide it seemed carved into my face. I remembered the vows, the promises, the belief that this woman beside me was loyal. That belief felt like it had belonged to someone naive, someone already dead. That night, while Elise finally slept in a deep postpartum exhaustion, I crept into the nursery. The baby stirred when I leaned over, his eyes opening just slightly. I whispered nothing to him, not because I didn't want to comfort him, but because I had nothing honest to say. Instead, I pulled the swab kit from my pocket. My hands shook as I brushed it gently against his cheek. He didn't cry. He didn't even flinch. It was as if he already knew secrets were being harvested from him. I sealed the sample and tucked it away. It would be mailed out in the morning. As I stood over the crib, I realized I wasn't just a man waiting for results. I was an investigator. Every detail mattered now. Elise's text alerts buzzing at odd hours, the late nights she chalked up to preparing for meetings, the sudden weekends away visiting her sister. My mind replayed everything, this time with a detective's lens, searching for cracks in the alibi she had built. The truth was no longer something I wanted. It was something I needed, and I wouldn't stop until I had it. The next few days blurred. Elise grew quieter, less defensive, almost as if she knew a clock was ticking somewhere in the background. The baby cried, ate, slept. Life went on with the artificial rhythm of normalcy. But under it all, I felt the hum of something inevitable coming closer. Every time the mail truck passed, my pulse quickened. Every time Elise checked her phone and smiled faintly, I wondered who was on the other end. Every night, I sat awake long after she had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction of the last year. When I finally received the package with the results, I didn't open it immediately. I sat with it in my lap, the weight of it almost unbearable. The answer was inside. Proof or vindication. Guilt or clarity. Once I opened it, there would be no pretending left, no margin for denial. But I knew one thing with certainty even before I tore it open. The boy upstairs was not mine. And the woman I had built my life with was hiding a truth that would change everything. The envelope sat on my desk, at work like it contained radioactive material. I had waited days for it, checking the tracking number every morning like a gambler watching the roulette wheel spin. When it finally landed in my hands, my pulse hammered so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't rip it open immediately. I closed my office door, turned the blinds so no one could see in, and just stared at the packet. The walls of my cubicle felt too tight, the hum of the air conditioning too loud. I imagined Elise at home, probably rocking the baby, maybe scrolling through her phone, maybe sending a text to whoever she thought was safe. She didn't know I was about to open the final crack in her facade. When I tore the seal and unfolded the paper, the words were both clinical and devastating. Probability of paternity, 0%. My vision tunneled. My hand shook, but I forced myself to read every line twice to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting. There was no room for doubt. The boy wasn't mine. I sat back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. It was strange. I had prepared for this. I had even told myself that the baby's skin tone alone was enough proof. But reading it in black and white felt like being shoved off a ledge. There was no ground left under me. That evening, I walked into the house with the results folded in my jacket pocket. Elise was in the kitchen, humming softly while the baby slept upstairs. She turned when she saw me, her expression already wary. It was the look of someone who had been expecting judgment to arrive eventually, like a bill she had forgotten to pay. I laid the paper on the counter between us. She stared at it, but didn't reach for it. Her face crumpled almost instantly, tears springing to her eyes without resistance. She said things like it was a mistake, and she didn't mean for it to happen. She insisted it was one time, a lapse, something she had buried the moment it happened. She said she loved me, that she wanted me, that the baby didn't change what we had. Her words slid off me like oil on glass. I didn't interrupt, didn't yell. I just watched her unravel, and the silence I gave her seemed to terrify her more than shouting ever could. Finally, when her excuses circled back around, I asked the only question that mattered. Who? She froze. The silence stretched so long I thought she might pretend she hadn't heard. Then, finally, she whispered a name. Anthony. The name meant nothing at first. I had never met him. Elise explained in broken sentences. He was someone she had met months earlier through work events, someone she barely knew, someone who meant nothing. She tried to spin it as a reckless encounter, as though the universe had just handed her a moment of weakness that she immediately regretted. But her eyes betrayed her. They flicked to the floor, to the wall, anywhere but me. She wasn't telling me the whole truth. That night, I didn't sleep in our bed. I camped out on the couch, staring at the ceiling with the DNA results spread across the coffee table. Elise cried herself to sleep upstairs. Every sob sounded rehearsed, like part of a script she had already prepared in her head. The next morning, I checked her phone while she showered. I had never done that in our entire relationship, but something in me had already changed. I wasn't her husband anymore. I was a detective, and detectives don't ask for permission. Her phone wasn't empty. It was scrubbed. Deleted messages, cleared histories. Too clean. Too careful. Which in itself was incriminating. People don't purge their phones unless they have something to hide. But technology leaves traces. She had overlooked her cloud backup. Buried in the restored archives were months of texts with Anthony. Not one night. Not one mistake. Conversations dripping with intimacy, with familiarity. Messages about weekends, about secret plans, about how she couldn't wait until the baby arrived and they could figure things out. The words burned into my brain. That evening, when I returned home from work, the doorbell rang just as I set down my bag. Elise's voice called from the kitchen. "Can you get it?" I opened the door, and there he was. Anthony. Tall, confident, skin tone a mirror of the baby upstairs. He wasn't surprised to see me. He didn't fumble for an explanation. He just looked past me, into the house, and asked how his son was doing. The audacity of it nearly knocked me flat. My grip tightened on the doorframe. For a moment, I considered slamming it in his face, but instead I let the silence weigh down on him. He shifted slightly, uneasy, but didn't back away. Elise appeared then, holding the baby. Her face drained when she saw Anthony standing in the doorway. The way her lips parted, the way her shoulders slumped, told me everything. He wasn't just some fling. He wasn't just a mistake. He was here because he felt entitled to be here. Because Elise had let him feel entitled. She stammered, asking him what he was doing, telling him he couldn't just show up. He ignored her. His eyes stayed fixed on the child in her arms, softening in a way that made bile rise in my throat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't shove him. I simply said, "You need to leave." For a second, he looked like he might argue, but something in my expression must have told him not to. He glanced at Elise, at the baby, then back at me. Finally, he nodded once, muttered something under his breath, and walked away. The door clicked shut. Elise immediately launched into a panicked explanation, saying she hadn't known he would come, that she had cut things off, that she didn't want him involved. But her voice trembled, and I could see through the cracks. This wasn't the first time he had shown up. Later that night, after the baby was asleep, Elise tried to plead again. She begged me to consider forgiveness, saying the baby didn't deserve to grow up without me, saying we could move past this if I wanted. But her desperation sounded less like love and more like self-preservation. I didn't answer. My silence was enough to terrify her. Over the next week, I began digging deeper. I checked bank statements. I combed through calendars. I tracked weekends she claimed to have spent with her sister. Patterns emerged, gaps, inconsistencies, nights she couldn't account for. I confronted her sister directly, under the guise of small talk. I asked her about specific weekends, casual but pointed. She faltered, stuttered, finally admitted she had covered for Elise, claiming Elise was with her when she wasn't. The betrayal widened. It wasn't just Elise hiding this. It was family helping her keep the mask in place. When I returned home that night, Elise was waiting in the living room. She looked pale, wrung out, her eyes red. She asked me what I wanted to do. I didn't answer. Instead, I told her plainly that things had already moved beyond her words. Proof was stacking up. Lies were unraveling. And the next step wasn't hers to decide. The baby cried upstairs. Elise rushed to pick him up, her voice breaking as she tried to soothe him. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, watching. For a fleeting second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then Anthony's face at the door flashed back into my memory, and the pity evaporated. She had built this. Now I was going to dismantle it. I thought seeing Anthony at the door was the worst of it, but it turned out he was just the opening act. Once he entered the picture, the threads of Elise's life began to unravel at a speed I hadn't expected. The more I pulled, the less of her story remained. I started with something simple: timelines. I laid out a calendar on my desk, marked every date Elise had claimed to be with her sister, every supposed business trip, every late night at the office. I cross-checked those against bank statements and email receipts. Gaps opened up like potholes. Hotel charges in neighborhoods nowhere near her office. Rideshare receipts logged at 2 in the morning. Venmo transfers labeled utilities, but routed to accounts I didn't recognize. The numbers didn't lie. Elise wasn't sloppy, but she wasn't careful enough. Then came the breakthrough I hadn't expected. One afternoon, while combing through my own credit report, something I'd never had reason to scrutinize before, I found an open line of credit I didn't remember applying for. The account had my name, my social security number, but the mailing address wasn't mine. It matched Anthony's. My stomach dropped. Elise hadn't just betrayed me with her body. She had signed me onto financial obligations I hadn't consented to. Fraud, plain and simple. That night, I confronted her with the paperwork. She crumbled fast, but her excuses sounded more desperate than sincere. She said she had panicked during her pregnancy, worried about money, convinced herself that pooling resources with Anthony for the baby would somehow make things easier. She promised it wasn't about choosing him over me. She said she always meant to fix it, to close the account before I noticed. Her tears didn't move me anymore. They were just background noise. I made copies of everything, every receipt, every statement, every log. If Elise thought she could drag me down in a custody battle, she was wrong. I was building a case file brick by brick. Still, there was one piece of the puzzle missing. I needed to know what kind of man Anthony really was. Elise had painted him as some fleeting mistake, then as a reluctant co-conspirator. But my gut told me otherwise. So I looked him up. Social media gave me more than Elise ever had. Photos of Anthony smiling with his wife, Clarissa, and their 2 children. Vacations, family dinners, barbecues in the backyard. His life looked stable, normal, the kind of domestic portrait Elise and I used to project. It took me 2 days to track down Clarissa's work email. I hesitated before sending the message, knowing it would detonate her life as much as mine. But in the end, I decided honesty was a gift we both deserved. I wrote, "My name is Jacob. I believe our spouses have been seeing each other. I have proof. Please contact me if you're willing to compare notes." She responded within an hour. We met the next day at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. Clarissa arrived early, her expression tight, her hands clenched around a coffee she hadn't touched. When I sat down, she looked at me with eyes that already knew the answer but needed confirmation. I laid out the documents, the DNA test, the phone records, the financial statements. She didn't flinch. She pulled her own folder from her bag. Inside were printouts of Anthony's credit card charges, photos of him, working late, in places no one works, screenshots of texts Elise must have sent in the middle of the night. Together, we pieced it together. Elise and Anthony hadn't just stumbled into an affair. They had mapped out an alternate reality, one in which I played the oblivious provider while they siphoned off resources and built a safety net. Clarissa's voice shook as she told me she had suspected something but never imagined the depth. She had stayed for the kids, for stability. Now, sitting across from me, she looked like someone who had finally been handed permission to stop pretending. We agreed on one thing immediately. If this was going to end, it had to end decisively. Half measures would leave both of us bleeding. That night, when I returned home, Elise tried to act normal. Dinner on the table, the baby cooing in the bassinet, the small talk about how her day had gone. I watched her as if she were a stranger squatting in my house. After the meal, I told her I knew about Clarissa. I told her we had met. The color drained from her face like a drain had been pulled. She tried to laugh it off, to claim Clarissa was unstable, that she was exaggerating. But her voice wavered, and she couldn't look me in the eye. I didn't push. I didn't need to. The trap was already closing. Over the next week, I kept collecting. I pulled my credit reports from all 3 agencies. I found not 1 but 3 accounts Elise had opened under my name. I traced the transfers to Anthony's accounts. I saved screenshots, printed backups, locked them in a drawer at work. Elise grew increasingly desperate. She hovered when I came home, tried to initiate conversations that sounded rehearsed, asked if we could see a counselor. She said she was worried I was detaching. I gave her nothing. Silence became my weapon. Then came the night she showed her hand. She cornered me in the kitchen, eyes wild, voice low. She said if I tried to leave her, she would fight for custody. She said judges favored mothers, that she would paint me as cold, as unfit. She hinted that she could make up stories if she had to. She told me no one would believe me over her. I looked at her and saw not my wife, but an adversary. Someone who had already decided the battlefield and was daring me to meet her there. But what she didn't know was that I already had an ally. Clarissa and I had agreed to share everything we uncovered. She had proof of Anthony's double life, proof that Elise had colluded. She even had a financial audit her attorney friend had run, showing how much money had been funneled out of my accounts. Elise thought she had leverage. She didn't realize I had built a wall of evidence around her. The final straw came when I found a notarized form with my signature at the bottom, except it wasn't my handwriting. Elise had forged it. The document authorized Anthony to co-sign a loan in my name. The audacity of it left me dizzy. I scanned it, filed it with the rest, and realized the line had been crossed. This wasn't just infidelity. This was crime. The woman I had married, the woman who once promised to spend her life beside me, had conspired to strip me not only of dignity, but of stability. And now, with the truth in my hands, I knew exactly what needed to come next. The question was no longer whether Elise had betrayed me. The question was how far I was willing to go to make sure she couldn't destroy me on her way down. The day I walked into my attorney's office with a folder full of evidence, I felt calmer than I had in months. The weight that had been pressing on my chest since the delivery room finally lifted, not because I was healed, but because I had turned pain into ammunition. My attorney, a sharp man named Douglas Hale, flipped through the pages slowly. He didn't interrupt, didn't make sympathetic noises. He just studied each document like a surgeon examining scans before an operation. Finally, he closed the folder and looked at me. "You've got enough here to bury her," he said. Those words carried no comfort, but they gave me direction. We filed for divorce within the week. Alongside it, we submitted the fraud charges, complete with notarized forgeries, bank statements, and evidence of unauthorized accounts. Elise was served at home. I wasn't there when the papers arrived, but later that night, she stormed into the living room, face streaked with tears and rage. She screamed that I was destroying her life. She screamed that I was vindictive, heartless, but her words didn't sting anymore. They just echoed against the armor I had built. I sat there silently until she finally ran out of breath, then told her the truth. She had destroyed her own life, long before I ever filed a single document. Elise's family, once vocal supporters, withdrew as the evidence became undeniable. Her parents, who had doted on her through the pregnancy, were horrified when I showed them proof of her fraud. They couldn't defend her anymore. Their phone call stopped. She was alone, cornered, and she knew it. The custody hearings were brutal. Elise argued that I had detached from the baby, that I had shown no bond. She claimed I was cold, unstable, unfit to parent. But every time she opened her mouth, my attorney presented receipts, texts, timelines. Then Clarissa testified. She stood in that courtroom and laid out Anthony's role, Elise's collusion, the months of deception. She even presented her own bank records showing how Elise had funneled money into Anthony's accounts. The judge listened, unimpressed by Elise's tears. In the end, the court recognized that I was not the biological father, but it also acknowledged the fraud Elise had committed. She lost her claim to spousal support, lost credibility as a petitioner. Custody defaulted to her, but with strict conditions, and the judge granted me visitation rights I hadn't even requested. An unusual decision, but one rooted in the fact that Elise had tried to manipulate the system. Anthony didn't fare better. Clarissa filed for divorce and gutted him financially. She walked away with the house, the savings, and full custody of their kids. Anthony was left juggling debt and scandal. His reputation at work collapsed when Clarissa leaked his financial schemes to his employer. He was forced to resign. Elise moved into a small apartment across town, a downgrade from the home we had built together. I knew she struggled to cover rent and daycare. Friends she once bragged to stopped answering her calls. Her social media accounts went silent. I should have felt satisfied, but satisfaction was too simple a word. What I felt was closure, the door slamming shut on a chapter one never wanted to live through again. Still, Elise had one more trick left. 2 months after the divorce finalized, I received a notice that Elise had filed a restraining order request, claiming I had been abusive. She alleged verbal threats, financial control, even suggested I had tried to turn the baby against her. None of it was true, but the accusation itself was dangerous. A mark like that could follow me for years. When we appeared in court, Elise tried to look fragile, her voice trembling as she recited her claims. She even brought a neighbor to testify that they had heard yelling through the walls. But what she didn't know was that I had prepared. During our separation, I had installed home cameras with audio, not for security, but for protection. Every interaction, every argument, every night of silence had been recorded. I submitted hours of footage, showing her threats, her breakdowns, her attempt to coerce me into staying. The judge reviewed the evidence, dismissed her request, and reprimanded her for abusing the court system. That was the final nail. Elise had tried to weaponize lies one last time, and it backfired. Months later, I saw her by chance at the grocery store. She looked thinner, worn, her hair tied back without effort, clothes wrinkled. She avoided eye contact, hurrying past with her cart and her child. Anthony was nowhere in sight. As for me, I focused on rebuilding. I poured myself into work, into friendships I had neglected. The betrayal had scarred me, but it had also sharpened me. I no longer ignored red flags, no longer dismissed instincts. People often ask if I regret anything. I don't. Regret implies I had a choice in Elise's actions. What I had was a choice in how I responded, and I chose not to let her lies bury me. Anthony lost his family. Elise lost her credibility. And I walked away with something stronger than revenge. Proof that the truth, once uncovered, has a way of burning everything false to the ground. The storm had ended, but its consequences remained. And for the first time since that nurse placed a child in my arms, I finally felt free.